Hi everybody. Over the course of the past few months, I have talked about pretty much every Pioneer deck. And one of the things that we focused on were play patterns and different nuances you probably need to know when you're playing these decks. And so here are notable play patterns and nuances in pretty much every Pioneer deck. Enjoy. You know, a lot of these nuances are mostly like individual card nuances or card combination nuances. It's a red-black mid-range deck. There's not a lot of insanely complex things going on that are unique to this deck. But it's still important to know about these things going into playing it. First off, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, or more or less Reflection of Kiki-Jiki, the flip side of Fable of the Mirror Breaker, can combo with itself. The way Reflection of Kiki-Jiki is worded is that it says the token is sacrificed at the beginning of the next end step. So if you have two Reflection of Kiki-Jikis on the battlefield and have an amount of mana available, you can have one Reflection of Kiki-Jiki copy the other Reflection of Kiki-Jiki, have the new token that now has haste copy a Reflection of Kiki-Jiki, and so on and so forth, and do that for all of your mana, so you have an extra copy of Reflection of Kiki-Jiki for every mana that you had during an end step that you activated, normally your opponent's end step, and then you get to untap with all these copies. Then you can either choose to attack with all of these Reflection of Kiki-Jikis or copy other things that are big. It's wildly powerful. Also, this is less of a nuance and more like a really common play pattern. Copying Archfiend of the Dross with Reflection of Kiki-Jiki is insane because you get multiple triggers from killing stuff, and it's a 6/6 flyer. I feel like that doesn't need to be said, but it's so good. Kind of keep jumping off of Reflection of Kiki-Jiki because it's important to understand, like, this is like the only complex card in the deck. Remember, you can copy Blood Tithe Harvester to make another blood token, so you can sacrifice Blood Tithe Harvester to kill even bigger creatures. But the new token of Blood Tithe Harvester has haste, so you can sacrifice that token to remove things. So Blood Tithe Harvester Reflection of Kiki-Jiki is kind of a removal spell on a stick for 1 mana. And to kind of dial it back on the Reflection of Kiki-Jiki thing, if we go to the second chapter of Fable of the Mirror Breaker, one thing I see people do all the time, and I am guilty of it sometimes as well, is discarding to Fable and like hoping. So we all know having a ton of land is awkward, but discarding the only land in your hand when you need to hit your land drop, just like hoping that you're going to hit another land, is obviously not a good thing. Or like if you need a card in 2 turns or need that land in 2 turns, you might not want to discard the land that you're going to play the turn after next. You know, unless you absolutely need a certain card, it's important not to discard cards that you need in the next turn or 2. Which sounds stupid, but people do it all the time with Fable. And the last nuance, if you are playing the Unstoppable Slasher Bloodletter combo, understand that it is literally a kill if you connect with Unstoppable Slasher and have Bloodletter on the battlefield. Because double of half is whole. It is literally Splinter Twin. Where this week, we're going to talk about nuances with the deck. Things that might not be super obvious when you're playing the deck. And the list is a little short. The deck is reasonably easy to play, but it's still really important to know about these things when you're playing red-black aggro. Now, first off, and this is something I mentioned during the deck tech, but I would also consider it a nuance, is Burn Together, which is the adventure side of Callous Sellsword, and pump spells. So the whole point of the deck is attacking, getting through damage with a bunch of crazy pump spells like Titan Strength and Monster's Rage and things like that. And so when you attack and then have a big pump spell turn, your creature's going to be 8 to 10, 11, 12 power sometimes. And very often you can kill somebody from 20 by dealing combat damage and then casting Burn Together to fling that creature and deal damage equal to its power to your opponent. So understand you want to pair Burn Together with those pump spells. Now, the interesting part of this is that a lot of the creatures in the deck have prowess-esque abilities. So it could be literal prowess like Monastery Swiftspear or like super prowess like Slickshot Show Off. So it's often much more than the pump spell itself. Now, if you pair Burn Together with Heartfire Hero, when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to the opponent. So that kind of doubles up with Burn Together. So you attack with Heartfire Hero, pump it up a few times. It gets Valiant, I think, is the ability. It's basically heroic, but counts for abilities as well. If Valiant's, pump it up to really like kind of artificially big with the pump spells. And then if you Burn Together, it deals combat damage, it deals damage from Heartfire Hero's trigger, and it deals the Burn Together fling damage, which is really incredible, actually. Similar to the burn together with pump spells, you can also have a massive Obnixilis paired with pump spells. So Casualty isn't caring about the mana cost, Casualty cares about its power. So similarly to burn together, you can have a big turn where you attack for a whole bunch, pump once or twice, and then look at your 7 to 12 power creature and sack it to Obnixilis to have a massive Obnixilis and immediately be able to alt. And the last kind of difficult to know when to do it nuance is Slickshot Show Off to avoid sorcery speed removal. There's a lot of very good sorcery speed removal like Portable Hole or Temporary Lockdown or things like that. And if you plot Slickshot Show Off, especially if you're not going to be casting any instants or sorceries that turn, it's actually very often worth it to hemorrhage that 1 damage you would get because of haste that 1 turn, to just play Slickshot Show Off for free the following turn, and then have all your mana for pump spells that following turn. Now, the thing you need to be careful about, like when you do this thing, is High Noon, because when you cast something off of plot, that is still casting, and people are playing High Noon for Phoenix and for Red-Black aggro. And so if you plot a Slickshot Show Off and then your opponent High Noons, you're in a lot of trouble, because now you can't pump spell after you bring back Slickshot Show Off. So just be very aware of that when you plot and use that kind of nuance. First off is Aven Interrupter comboing with Elite Spellbinder. Aven Interrupter does its effectively counterspell thing. It exiles a spell from the stack, but then it says spells that are cast from exile cost 2 more to cast, which means by itself, the thing that is plotted from the stack now costs 2 to cast from plot. That's decent, and it like combos with more Aven Interrupters and whatnot. But Elite Spellbinder also exiles a card from the hand, and they can cast it, though it costs 2 more to cast. Aven Interrupter increases the tax on that even further. And a little less of like a direct combo, but you can follow that up with Anointed Peacekeeper to increase the tax on casting that thing from exile even more, just to really make sure that spell is just never ever cast. And there's really only 2 other major nuances that aren't super obvious, and they both have to do with Eldrazi Displacer. A lot of versions are playing 2 Eldrazi Displacer now, but remember, Eldrazi Displacer can blink creatures so that they can't be removed by spot removal. It also combos with Enter the Battlefield effects, including Enduring Innocence. So you can bounce something that would trigger an Enduring Innocence, and it triggers Enduring Innocence again, as well as like Aven Interrupter, which means that, you can continue plotting spells that are on the stack, etc., etc. It also has a really neat interaction with Skyclave Apparition. Skyclave Apparition is worded like the old like O-Ring effect cards, where the exiling of something and what happens when Skyclave Apparition leaves the battlefield are 2 entirely different triggers. They are not a part of the same trigger. Which means if you play a Skyclave Apparition, target something to exile, you can bounce Eldrazi Displacer in response to the trigger. The second trigger will happen, but it has not yet exiled anything so that your opponent doesn't get a spirit. And then when it re-enters, you can exile a new thing. Now that first thing is still exiled, but there is no Skyclave Apparition that did exile it on the battlefield anymore. So it is just gone forever. And now it's that second thing that is exiled with Skyclave Apparition underneath, the same one. You need a lot of mana to be able to do this, but it's still really important to understand like how insane that combo is. The first nuance is, remember, Bring to Light is a toolbox card. And it's really important to remember all of the cards in your deck that you can grab with Bring to Light and understand what cards are good in what situations. And so, Bring to Light is over 10 cards that can get you out of certain situations. It isn't always the value grabs. Speaking of the value grabs, there are 2 major value grabs with Bring to Light. One is Niv Mizzet, which I talked about a lot during my deck tech, but the other is Valki, because you can cast the opposite side of Valki, the Tibalt Planeswalker, off of Bring to Light because of weird rules interactions. And so especially into a clear board, that is often the value grab, because it produces a threat that's really difficult to answer, is able to answer your opponent's creatures, and is card advantage in and of itself. Speaking of Bring to Light, remember that Bring to Light can't actually grab everything in your deck. Specifically, enchantments and artifacts can't be grabbed with Bring to Light, so you can't grab your Rest in Peace or your Damping Sphere or anything like that off of Bring to Light, so it isn't a perfect toolbox. And maybe the least obvious nuance in the Bring to Light deck is don't play your swamp really early if you can help it, because if you do, then you can't cast Omnath on 4, and you can't do the turn 5 cast Omnath, play Fable, grab a basic swamp, play Niv Mizzet. And so we'd like to not draw the swamp, but especially don't play the swamp in the early turns if you can help it. And I wanted to lead this off with how to combo with the deck, because the deck is decidedly still a combo deck, even though it doesn't have Karn. Yes, it has a big green guy beat down alternative plan, but primarily you're looking to combo. And the way that you combo is by getting a ton of devotion, drawing a ridiculous amount of cards with Kiora and Outcast or Trailblazer, getting many creatures on the battlefield, untapping Nykthos with Kioras or extra Kioras that you draw to add even more mana, hitting more Nykthoses with like Cavalier to add even more mana, etc., 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 until you have a bunch of creatures and a bunch of mana, and then you play an Ulvenwald oddity, flip it, everything has haste and trample, and then you jam. That's the combo. And so all of your plays should be working towards that combo if you can. In addition, some other things that you might need to know about. Leyline of the Guildpact, as you probably know, is in the deck just for its devotion to green. It's 4 green pips. But also remember, if you have a Leyline of the Guildpact, your lands tap for any colored mana, including your Nykthos. So if you're worried about cards like Stonebrain or other extraction effects, you can play a Leyline of the Guildpact during your pregame actions, and then your first land can just be Nykthos, and you can still play your Mana Dork while getting around those extraction effects, which is kind of cool. One of the weirdest things about this deck when you first pick it up is the Outcaster Trailblazer timings. And the biggest thing about Outcaster Trailblazer is, again, remember this is a combo deck. If you were just trying to beat down, of course, you would never plot Outcaster Trailblazer, or very rarely plot Outcaster Trailblazer, but you want to create really big turns. And if giving up 4 damage and plotting Outcaster Trailblazer on turn 2 or turn 3 means that you can have it come off plot to create a mana so you can play a Cavalier a turn earlier, or a Storm the Festival a turn earlier, or multi-spell, is way better. Or even better, like plot the Outcaster Trailblazer when you have 3 mana, next turn play Kiora, and then cast Outcaster Trailblazer off of plot to be able to draw a card off of Kiora, because drawing extra cards is extremely important when you're trying to combo, is where you should probably be with this deck. However, it normally being right to plot Outcaster Trailblazer does not mean High Noon goes away. So remember, High Noon exists when you're playing this card, because having something come off plot it counts as a spell. Sometimes when you Storm the Festival, you're going to hit a Kiora and a creature when you already have a Kiora on the battlefield. Understand that everything enters, and then the Planeswalker thing, like Legendary Rule, happens. So both Kioras are going to see that creature enter from Storm the Festival before the Planeswalker thing happens, so you'll be drawing 2 cards. Just important to remember. And this is true of the old Nykthos deck as well. But be sure to activate Nykthos, if you can, in most situations. Activate Nykthos in response to the Cavalier of Thorns trigger in case you hit another Nykthos, because you don't have a chance to activate Nykthos again before grabbing that extra Nykthos and putting it on the battlefield from Cavalier of Thorns and then legendarying each other out. So say you have access to 9 mana, one of them's a Nykthos, you Storm the Festival, 3 mana left over, including Nykthos, hit a Cavalier. Awesome. So you want that Cavalier to enter the battlefield. But before the Cavalier trigger actually resolves, you can activate Nykthos and get the devotion from Cavalier counting towards Nykthos. And then if you hit another Nykthos off of Cavalier, it's even better. I think everybody that has learned this deck has encountered a situation where you hit the second Nykthos off of Cavalier and you like roll your eyes because you could have had so much more mana. So just remember that. And in that same vein, navigate your turns in a sense that the Cavalier resolving is one of the last things going on, so that you can get maximum devotion off of Nykthos and you aren't like hemorrhaging devotion by doing that, like in response to the Cavalier trigger trick. First off, impending triggers still trigger up the beanstalk. I think it's really important to understand that. Even though a cost is reducing your paying an alternate cost, all it cares about is the cost in the top right. So whether you're playing Leyline Binding for 1, or paying 3 mana for a Overlord of the Hauntwoods, you will still draw a card off of an Up the Beanstalk on the battlefield. Second, and this kind of goes without saying and really just comes with playing the deck a lot, Be aware of the enchantments you need to have on the battlefield, especially the turn you play an Enigmatic Incarnation, to grab the cards in your deck and to toolbox your deck properly. So especially when you have an Enigmatic Incarnation hand or you have a chance to draw it, you might have to change what enchantments you play earlier in the game so that you can grab the cards from your deck that are good in certain situations. And it's just something that's really important to keep in mind. One really good example of that, and another nuance, is if you leyline binding a token early, then when you sacrifice Leyline Binding to Enigmatic Incarnation, then your opponent doesn't get anything back, but you get an Atraxa or an Overlord of the Mistmoors. Both absolutely unbelievably good. And if you're just picking up the deck, you might be wondering why you're playing Zur Eternal Schemer. Now, while manning up a Leyline Binding is really cool, or blocking with a Death Touch Nowhere to Run or whatever, when you turn an impended Overlord into a creature, the way that it works is technically it's still impended. Its power and toughness are going to be the mana cost, like it said on Zur. But none of the text on that enchantment, now creature, has been removed just by it being impended. So when you attack with one of these Overlords, it'll still trigger the thing on the Overlord. So for example, if you impend an Overlord of the Mistmoors, you get two 2/1s. You play a Zur, activate an Overlord of the Mistmoors. It is now a 7/7 because that's its mana cost, and you attack with it, and it creates 2 more 2/1s. It is unbelievable. Also, as kind of another side note with that, when the impending counter falls off and there's no more impending counters on it, and technically this card isn't impending anymore, the Zur power and toughness overrides the power and toughness that is on the card. This one is kind of obvious, but is still important to mention. Remember that Yorion lets enter the battlefield triggers resolve again. Things like Nowhere to Run, you can turn a Yorion into a removal spell. But also, a big reason why we're playing it is it resets impending. By resets, I mean it just removes impending. So if I have 2 impended Overlords that are not creatures, and I play Yorion and bounce them, not only do I get the enter the battlefield triggers again, but they enter as their creature form, which can cause giant swings. And then the last thing that's important to mention is what to name with Cavern of Souls. So 90% of the time, you're going to be just naming Avatar so that your important creatures, basically, which are your avatars, can enter the battlefield. Also, it's important that you can cast Overlord of the Boiler Bilges if you draw it, because you can't really always rely on Overlord of the Hauntwood. Sometimes, depending on your hand, and you'll learn this just by playing a bunch, sometimes you will need to name Human or Wizard so that you can cast Zur. But also remember, when you side in Rurik Thar, that's red as well, and we don't have any red lands besides the Overlord of the Hauntwood land or Cavern of Souls, so you might need to name Warrior. And you want to name Warrior because we have other warriors in our deck, and you might as well make them uncounterable, and we don't have any other ogres in our deck. And having something like a Rurik Thar, especially if we're siding it in, having it stuck in our hand is a nightmare, even though our plan is to fetch it out. A lot of the weird things with the deck are revolving around Fountain Port. And when you're playing with Fountain Port, remember that you can sack any token to Fountain Port, not just the fish token or the treasure token that Fountain Port makes. This includes maps that are made with Restless Anchorage. This includes clue tokens that are made with Deduce. I'm not sure why you would sack the clue token with Fountain Port. This seems like just wasting extra mana, but you can. This includes Samurai tokens, which is really relevant if you're just like digging. As far as more Fountain Port stuff, remember that you can make treasure with it, which means you can get the red mana to sacrifice to High Noon. So High Noon doesn't always have to be the thing that just sits there. And remember, that 5 damage can go face, which is pretty relevant, especially in matchups where High Noon doesn't do anything since you're playing it main deck. Sort of off of Fountain Port as well, remember the Teferi Plus activation, if you have enough mana, can create multiple activations of a land like Fountain Port in the same turn. So you can, let's say, make a fish with Fountain Port, activate Teferi, draw a card, untap Fountain Port in one other land, and then be able to still sacrifice that fish to be able to draw a card. And the last, like, small nuance that I think is important to understand that isn't, like, super obvious with the deck is if you are playing the Kahira version and are also playing Hullbreaker Horror in the sideboard, remember you can't reveal Kahira as your companion if you sideboard in Hullbreaker Horror. I know I shouldn't have to say that, but I know people are doing it just out of like muscle memory. Just remember that. That is a little awkward though, because a lot of the matchups where you will be casting Kahira, you're bringing in Hullbreaker Horror. So it's really tough. My camera died, but it's really tough. First off, let's talk about how the Yigra combo actually works. So what you're trying to do is make sure you have a Yigra on the battlefield in either a food or a cauldron familiar and another cauldron familiar in the graveyard. And because Yigra makes other creatures food, what you can do is sacrifice that food or other cauldron familiar to the cauldron familiar in the graveyard, bring it back, you gain one, your opponent loses one. That new cauldron familiar on the battlefield is a food, so you can take the cauldron familiar that's in the graveyard now, sacrifice the cauldron familiar on the battlefield, you gain one, your opponent loses one. Now there's another cauldron familiar in the graveyard, and do that over and over and over until your opponent dies. That's the basics of the combo. There's a lot of ways to get there, mostly alongside Scavenger's Talent, because Scavenger Talent allows you to sacrifice things and then self-mill to be able to get those cats and eventually a Yigra in the graveyard. And it's okay if the Yigra hits the graveyard because we can use Scavenger's Talent's third ability to sack all the crazy artifacts and permanents that we have to just bring Yigra back and then do the combo because we've milled ourselves a whole bunch. Scavenger's Talent also has a couple other really interesting nuances with it where we can chump with cats effectively indefinitely because we get a food whenever a creature dies. And so our opponent attacks with a big creature, we chump with our 1/1, it dies, we get a food because we trigger Scavenger's Talent, and then on our opponent's end step, we just bring back the cat by sacrificing the food that was created when the cat died. There's a couple other like more obvious ones that aren't centered around these like newish cards. Mayhem Devil, remember it triggers on your opponent's sacrificing things as well. So this is like your opponent's treasures is probably the most common one, you know, food, whatever. So make sure you remember that. It's really hard to remember those triggers in Paper. And the way you always want to play Claim the Firstborn is by stealing something your opponent has and then sacrificing it. You don't really want to be playing Claim the Firstborn unless your opponent's just dead. If you're just like, if it's just an act of treason. So you want to Claim the Firstborn, jam with the creature, and then sacrifice it to either a Witch's Oven or a Deadly Dispute. And then the last sort of play pattern nuance that I wanted to go over is stacking Kroxa triggers properly. So most of the time, stacking the triggers don't really matter. Remember that you can sacrifice the creature before it is sacrificed to its I guess trigger, to Deadly Dispute or Witch's Oven before that trigger like actually resolves. So you can get a little extra value out of it. But also if you're afraid your opponent has instant speed graveyard hate, if you stack the Kroxa triggers so that the discard happens first and then the sacrifice happens, the way the game sort of works in the background is your opponent does the discard thing, cool, the sacrifice, the only thing on the stack, that resolves. But the thing is, when the stack is clear, the active player is the first one that gets priority. So when that resolves, Kroxa's in the graveyard because it was sacrificed. And then you as the active player have priority, so you can immediately escape it if you have the mana, and your opponent has no opportunity to exile Kroxa while it's in the graveyard. So that's a really, really important nuance that comes up more than you would think. First off is remembering Valiant in Heartfire Hero and Emberheart Challenger. There's a ton of ways to trigger Valiant and making Heartfire Hero much bigger so that it can attack for much more, and then when it dies, deal that much more damage. And Emberheart Challenger allows you to kind of become a Howling Mine. There's a lot of ways to trigger Valiant. Some of the more obvious ways would be like Monstrous Rage, would be Reckless Rage, would be Bushwhack, would be Snakeskin Veil, just as spells to make Heartfire Hero bigger and to draw, or not draw cards, but exile cards so you can play them with Emberheart Challenger. But also Manifold Mouse allows you to target every single turn without spending a card or spending any mana. And same thing with Innkeeper's Talent. So remember those cards, and capitalizing on Heartfire Hero growing and getting more cards off of Emberheart Challenger every turn is a super important aspect of this deck. Next up is Screaming Nemesis. So Screaming Nemesis obviously like makes it hard to block, you know, being able to deal damage to the opponent, make sure they don't gain life. But also remember that you can Reckless Rage Screaming Nemesis to deal 2 damage to Screaming Nemesis, 4 damage to something else, which means that something else likely dies. And then that 2 damage that is dealt to Screaming Nemesis can also be dealt to a creature or to the opponent and make them not gain life. So Reckless Rage can end up being like a 2-for-1 / 3-for-1 when used in combination with Screaming Nemesis. And similar thing with Burst Lightning. If you're just going to Burst Lightning your opponent, you might as well Burst Lightning the Screaming Nemesis and make it so they can't gain life for the rest of the game. Speaking of Reckless Rage, it's important to remember that nearly every creature we have, Reckless Rage won't kill when we deal damage to it. Heartfire Hero, as long as it's already been triggered once in a previous turn, the Heartfire Hero trigger will resolve before Reckless Rage resolves, and so it won't die. Monastery Spear Prowess will trigger before Reckless Rage, so it won't die. Same thing with Emberheart Challenger. Questing Druid's in a similar vein as Heartfire Hero. As long as it's been triggered once, then it's totally okay. And we've already talked about Screaming Nemesis. And so Reckless Rage becomes a reasonably unconditional removal spell as long as you fulfill those very easy conditions. Also, most red-green decks are running some amount of Thud. This is mostly to capitalize on like Monstrous Rage, off of making a creature very big, dealing a bunch of damage, and then thudding and destroying our opponent. But it's extra good with Heartfire Hero. If we have a big Heartfire Hero, maybe we pump it up with a Monstrous Rage and have a bunch of triggers over the course of the past few turns. We attack our opponent, you know, maybe it's 7 power, we deal 7 damage, and then we can Thud to fling that Heartfire Hero at the opponent, deal another 7, trigger Heartfire Hero, deal an additional 7. It is just ridiculous, and it's important to remember that flinging Heartfire Hero, or really flinging any card in our deck that's been pumped up, is very powerful. And I'm going to start off with more obvious ones and then move on to less obvious ones. First off is make sure you're tapping the right colors on your Lotus Field so you can eventually cast the cards that you plan on casting. You kind of have to plan out your turn very often. More than once have I been playing against a Lotus Field combo player and they can't cast the Emergent Ultimatum in their hand because they just tapped for wrong colors. That being said, if you aren't really sure about your line and you don't know what colors to tap, blue is always a pretty safe choice, but really you should be thinking about it. Remember, Archdruid's Charm can be a part of lines that go multiple phases. So if you want access to your graveyard, you can grab Archdruid's Charm. You can play Archdruid's Charm to grab Leer to then be able to cast these cards in your graveyard, or maybe a more common line is Archdruid's Charm to grab Fae of Wishes to eventually be able to grab the Approach to the Second Sun out of the sideboard. Just Archdruid's Charm is almost always a multiple step process, especially when you're grabbing creatures out of your deck. There's a lot of ways to combo kill with the deck. The most common one is making a bunch of mana through untapping the Lotus Fields, in some fashion, Emergent Ultimatum into even more mana and grabbing Approach to the Second Sun from the sideboard and then just like casting it twice. But if you play Chandra Hope's Beacon, there's some other ways to combo. Specifically, if you have like Omniscient, Chandra Hope's Beacon, and 3 Balaged Recovery is a loop and infinite mana, which is awesome. It's remember post sideboard, it's totally okay to cast Vizier of Tumbling Sands to be able to untap your Lotus Field like on a whim, because your opponents are going to sideboard out some number or sometimes all of their removal, and having it on the battlefield is kind of just better. That being said, it's almost always incorrect to do that in game 1 because they have the removal in the deck and you should probably just cycle it. If you happen to have sideboarded out one of the Balaged Recoveries or have it exiled and are playing the Chandra version, there's actually a way to combo with Chandra as well, with 2 Balaged Recoveries and Ottawa Sorin City to like bounce the Chandra and be able to replay it. This one is not infinite mana, but it can get you to 20 damage. Remember, you can cipher Hidden Strings onto Strict Proctor or Vizier, especially onto the Strict Proctor. It happens a lot. And speaking of Hidden Strings, remember it can tap down your opponent's lands too, especially if you're afraid of counter magic or something like that. Tap down your opponent's lands, go to second main phase, and then kill them while your opponent can't interact with you. When you cast Emergent Ultimatum, normally your pile is going to be Omniscience, Dark Petition, and Pour Over the Pages. However, sometimes if you're afraid of not being able to fully combo and your opponent has a really good board presence, it is correct to go Pour Over the Pages, Dark Petition, Sunfall, or a board wipe or something to interact. And then lastly, to go back to Strict Proctor, generally you don't want to run out Strict Proctor on turn 2. You really want to be able to combo it with Lotus Field. So try to play Strict Proctor the same turn you're going to play Lotus Field normally on turn 3. So let's jump into it with Overlord being able to bring back Greasefang. One of the major reasons you play Overlord of the Balemark not only is to fill your graveyard with vehicles, but remember, it can grab, not FOMO, sure, but also Greasefang. So it's a way to get Greasefang out of the graveyard and a way to like search for and draw for Greasefang, so it makes your combo way more consistent. Speaking of FOMO, fear of missing out can get multiple attacks when you have Parhelion on the battlefield to effectively just win. If you have Delirium and you do the Parhelion combo, you can untap Parhelion and just win in the air that turn. You can also do a similar thing with Overlord of the Balemark to get multiple triggers off of Overlord and be able to attack with Overlord multiple times with FOMO. It turns out something that gives you multiple combat phases and untaps a creature is really good alongside things that have like attack triggers. And then the last thing that isn't super duper obvious that you can do is, remember, you can Thoughtseize yourself to get a vehicle in the graveyard to play a Greasefang in combo. Now remember, this kind of hemorrhages value because it means you're not Thoughtseizing your opponent, especially if Thougtseize is in your deck. And it opens you up to being million for one by them being able to interact with the combo. So you got to make sure you do it when the coast is clear or you're desperate. But Thoughtseizing yourself is always an option. To remember that. First off, and I've mentioned this a million times, the Slasher Bloodletter combo. If you have Bloodletter on the battlefield and you connect with Unstoppable Slasher, you just win the game because Bloodletter doubles the amount Unstoppable Slasher makes their opponent lose off of the trigger. Unstoppable Slasher says the opponent loses half life, and double half is in fact whole. It is a Splinter Twin combo. You just win. Speaking of Unstoppable Slasher, it can be kind of difficult to do the Unstoppable Slasher math. At least it like racks my brain a little bit. So the way Unstoppable Slasher is worded is they lose half their life rounded up. For some reason, my brain decides like, okay, it's 13, right? Half of 13 is 6.5. So they should end up with 7 life because it's rounded up. That's not actually how it works. They lose the amount of life rounded up. So half of 13 is 6.5 rounded up to 7. That's how much they lose from 13. So they end up at 6. For some reason, it's really hard to wrap my brain around. And I just felt like it was important to mention because there have to be other people out there like me that for some reason have a hard time with Unstoppable Slasher math. Some versions of Mono Black Midrange are playing Heartless Act. It's important to remember with Heartless Act that if your opponent plays Archfiend of the Dross, you can remove counters of it with Heartless Act and kind of just win the game because when they untap, the upkeep trigger makes them lose. Unholy Annex cares about demons and allows you to drain 2 life rather than lose 2 life when Unholy Annex triggers on your end step. Remember that Mutavault is a demon. You don't necessarily have to have any of your normal demons on the battlefield. You can activate Mutavault, maybe even with itself, to make sure that you drain off Unholy Annex if you don't need the mana, obviously. Also, Heartless Act doesn't care what kind of counters they are. So Heartless Act, while is a very good removal spell, you can also target your own Unstoppable Slasher with it to remove the stun counters so that you can untap with Unstoppable Slasher even at the end of your opponent's turn, and they might not expect an attack from Unstoppable Slasher if you like remove the counters and are able to untap with it, and you can catch a lot of opponents by surprise. Heartless Act is very good in this deck. If you like this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. Check me out on social medias. Links are above me and in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.